So, Jessica, hi. Thank you so much for coming back.
Thank you for having me again.
Pleasure. There were so many things that we touched on last time that it felt like we could really flesh out a bit more. And I thought a good place to start is with the idea of spiritual bypassing
Sure.
that we touched into. I know that's something that's talked about quite a lot
hmm
now. Um, at what point did you realize that that's something you'd been doing?
Yeah, it's a good question. To be honest, I have a feeling the moment that I first was introduced to the concept, I realized that I had been doing that to an extent. Because if you don't even know what it is, it's hard to reflect to say, oh, I may be using spirituality as an escape in certain ways rather than actually, facing things to work through and transform. And so I know, I think in our previous talk, I think I mentioned that retreat I went to with Jeff Foster, where the whole sort of edifice of, the self-negating non-duality and neo-Advaita just came crashing down when he was saying, actually, like it was a mistake for me to be teaching, self abandonment and, self-negation. Actually, where I've come to now is seeing that this really should be about self compassion and befriending yourself and befriending all of these wounded parts of yourself rather than trying to just kind of cut them away or exile them. And because it was so much more compelling and, humanistic, it felt like, oh my God, wow, like this, if I had heard that before, I think I might have chosen that path instead. And then he had even, I believe, at that event, which was him and Matt Licata, started talking about the problem of spiritual bypassing and how when we're turning away from these wounded parts of ourselves or the parts that we don't like with spirituality, with, non-duality, that really what we're doing is, um, yeah, like kind of pushing those wounds and those wounded parts kind of under the floorboards rather than embracing them and healing them and that sort of thing. And they said, that's an example of spiritual bypassing. And so I was able to just recognize, I remember writing in my journal, oh my God, I think I've been spiritual bypassing. And that's not, I wouldn't say that everything that I had done and experienced on that non-dual journey was bypassing because I was in therapy. I was still going to therapy, but I certainly wasn't going into everything that I could be going into. And so, yeah, there were elements of things that I had been bypassing, and a lot of that stuff, which you and I have talked about a lot, was related to cPTSD, which, for those who don't know what that is, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is often used to describe um, different types of woundings and like harmful effects that somebody will get through narcissistic abuse, being in a relationship with a narcissist, or being raised by a narcissist, or in psychological types of abuse that really kind of make you feel kind of ashamed of parts of yourself and feel invalidated and feel like you have to suppress your own individuality and self-expression and needs and desires, etc. And so the whole renunciation program seemed to be, you know, a way of kind of, I guess, and maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but just realizing the extent to which so many of the messages in the teachings in self-negating non-duality, neo-Advaita, that they were really mirroring so many of the messages that I had received from a narcissistic person that I grew up with who had deeply affected my sense of self. And I just thought, oh my God, like every single teacher that I had been following was putting out those types of messages that were self-shaming, shaming individuality and self-expression and, trying to erase boundaries rather than strengthening them and teaching de-individuation rather than healthy individuation and that sort of thing. And yeah, at that moment, it became clear to me the extent to which I had been doing spiritual bypassing and that was actually being promoted um, to such a great extent.
Thank you. Absolutely. I think with self-negating non-duality, we can see the bypassing aspect of that writ large, as you say,
Right.
because it's such an overt rejection of our humanness.
Yeah.
No, to say there is no you, to say there is no self, as you say, it took me a long time before I could see the link between that and what you just described as the narcissistic abuse. And I grew up in a similar context to that.
Right.
And I think it took a long time to see that one of the fundamentals of that kind of narcissistic dynamic is that we're not we're not held as fellow subjects by the narcissist,
Right.
right? That from the narcissistic perspective, everybody else in the orbit is object rather than subject,
Right.
which is tantamount to saying another way of saying you don't exist except on a very, it's not like necessarily people are saying that verbally, but that's the message that we got, right? That there was something inherent in that wasn't being seen, wasn't being acknowledged around our selfhood, our existence as an individual self and subject. And I think there are other ways that spirituality, which may be less seemingly extreme than self-negating non-duality, also feeds into that,
Sure.
right? That there are certain ways that we should be. What you said about boundaries, I think, is really a perfect illustration of that. That this idea that we should be open, that we should be accepting, that we should be grateful,
Yeah.
have strands of that initial messaging in them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, with that, which you do see in a lot of new age spirituality at large, is the whole kind of, say yes to everything and, don't resist anything, don't fight anything. So, you know, if you're if you're suffering from an experience, it just means that it's because you're saying in your head that you're judging that as good or bad. And so I certainly heard a lot of some of these teachers even go as far as to um, tell people that even if they're in some type of abuse situation, if they just let go of the judgments that it's good or bad, then they won't have to suffer anymore. So really kind of turning people into, you know, extremely passive in the face of things that can even be extremely dangerous and toxic. So that's, really disturbing when you see that.
It's so disturbing. It's a denial of any kind of sense of agency, isn't it?
It's
Right?
very,
Any kind of sense of selfhood or self-advocating.
yeah, that any desire to change or any resistance of what's happening is just your ego that's coming in to judge and categorize things, and that's again not spiritual or going to condemn you to suffer forever and that sort of thing.
Well, one of the things that struck me when you were talking about bypassing a moment ago was how it's inseparable from the exclusion of the body, right? It feels like that coming up and out of the somatic realm is
Yeah.
absolutely a part of that, isn't it? And a denial or um, a rejection of everything
Mm.
that's happening within the realm of the bodily.
That's a really good point because that's, one of the things that makes these paths so attractive is that it is a sense of relief to be able to disconnect from the body and identify with, amorphousness and thinking that you're not the body and almost bypassing experience itself. Actually, if it's okay, I wanted to read a quote from somebody who messaged me that had also been, experienced a lot of harmful effects from his non dual journey. And he said, I really messed myself up with this kind of non duality. It helped me cope with narcissistic abuse while simultaneously mirroring narcissistic abuse back to me on a spiritual level. So there's really that kind of nuance there that yes, disconnecting from the body, just like any type of dissociation, is kind of a coping mechanism. And so of course, and I have empathy for people, including, myself, for wanting a path that could allow me to kind of just, rise above whatever I'm feeling and not feel like I have to react to it. So
Absolutely. I mean, same here. I mean, I really get how we're drawn to spiritual bypassing, and I think there's something really important in saying when we're not making anyone wrong for
right.
doing that for precisely the reasons you just described. We're talking about moving out and away from excruciating pain. And I think particularly in the case of narcissistic abuse, the the global shame that is part of that I think is inherent in that, isn't it? That it isn't just that parts of us are shameful, but this in the entirety of what this is shameful. And I think that often comes from being relentlessly criticized or whatever the form the abuse is taken.
Yeah, the criticizing aspect is, I think, is huge, because one of the things that happens when you kind of first dip into these self-negating non-dual teachings is, like, for me, I can even recognize in one of the first books I read, which was Eckhart Tolle, and I'm not denying that there are some really helpful aspects of that book in terms of becoming more present, but it's also really a polemic against the self, against the ego. And so it kind of comes in really hard with picking apart everything about yourself, all your judgments, all your perceptions, all of your desires to, for things to be right or wrong. All of that is, somehow bad. And I don't know if you are familiar, but he talks about something called the pain body, which is kind of an expression to describe, all of the wounded parts of ourselves that lead to an inner critic kind of voice. But, ironically, we're being criticized for having the inner critic in the first place. So that pain body is really kind of shamed and turned into sort of like this monster kind of being. And so I did some conversations with a psychologist named Guy Smith, who actually used to teach radical non-duality, but realized how misguided and dangerous it was, and now is a somatic psychotherapist. And one of the points that he was making was that he called it sort of like the inner non-dual gaslighter, that you start to end up internalizing all these voices from this type of non-dual teaching, where, you're now criticizing yourself for all of these kind of very natural things, like, oh, if I want to, stand up to this abusive person, or if I want to get out of this situation, it's just the ego telling a story, and it's all egoic, and all your motivations are selfish. And so I thought that was very interesting, the way that it, again, kind of perpetuates like this inner inner gaslighter, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me from my experience and from working with other people too that kind of spirituality adds a like a top layer to the inner critic that's already there for reasons we just described, that compounds it because it comes with these teachings come with the idea that they are the truth with a capital T, and that everything else is simply a story or illusion or whatever language is used. And I think that probably makes it even harder to see because part of it is that it's made out to be this truth. Was that your experience of it?
Definitely. And that was another kind of area that I wanted to touch on today, because it's so important to realize how that sort of dogmatic um, element of any set of teachings that claims to be the unquestionable ultimate truth, and sort of undermines any of your, critical thinking or questioning of it, um, is really a form of gaslighting to a great extent, when you're teaching people to undermine their own self-trust and trust in their own perception of things. And that's was such a big message that I absorbed, was literally, do not trust your mind. Do not trust your ego, because it's lying to you. Because it's not real, for example. And, I got that from, I have this clip from Adyashanti, who was someone that I followed very, very strongly. And there's a clip where a girl comes up to the microphone at a satsang, and she says something like, I just don't, I just feel like I don't know if I can trust myself. And he says, don't. And she says, don't what? And he says, don't trust yourself. And so, you can just again see how that so much mirrors the way that, psychological abusers and narcissistic abuse. It's so heavy handed on your perceptions are not valid. Oh, you're thinking that X is happening. No, no, no. It's Y. And that's such a heavy part of it that erodes your ability to really trust your own sense of things. And that is piled on with, these sort of anti-ego, self-negating stories. But the thing is that just like in narcissistic abuse, it's a person telling you, don't trust yourself, trust me, or trust my paradigm, trust my teachings. And then there's a sort of element of, authoritarianism and spirituality. And there's the notion of spiritual abuse that I, started researching and finding very prevalent in those years.
Absolutely. I mean, the word that was coming to me just now was fundamentalism.
Yes, for
No,
sure.
that there's an absolute certainty. I mean,
Mhm.
it's still shocking to me and pains me to hear those kinds of accounts where, people being deliberately told to not trust
Yeah,
themselves, and as we know, the damage that can happen as a result of that, and how for you in particular, I think, because still to this day never read any Eckhart Tolle. Actually, I was never drawn to him. My spell in non-duality was much shorter, and I think I said in the first episode, it felt like I was already too deep into the dark night to be able to effectively bypass. I mean, not that I wasn't trying,
right. But it was just coming up uncontrollably.
but
And
my body wasn't having any of it. So yes, it was uncontrollable. And I think what I came to see over the years, and this has been endlessly confirmed, is that actually what we need to do is a complete 180-degree turn from that. I mean, all the messages we would now say would be the complete opposite, wouldn't they? They would be, yes, absolutely trust yourself, and starting to support that growing sense of agency and selfhood, and feeling into deeper and deeper layers of that, and
yeah,
the instinct and intelligence inherent in the deep layers of that.
yeah, yeah.
How much of the attraction of that kind of teaching do you think is the certainty of it?
I think it's a critical element of it. I always say that in my experience and understanding, there's typically two reasons why people are drawn to, I mean, because we're talking about this specifically, to these types of non-dual paths that teach that, ultimate truth is there's no self, or that the true self is just pure awareness. Either that it's, really just coming from wanting the relief that's being offered from suffering, which was mainly my motivation, or they're seeking truth. They want the certainty of what's the truth. And there's these people that are so convincing that they know it. And sometimes it's a combination of both. But when I talk to people about what, got them into it, so much of it is wanting to know what is the truth about. And that's kind of like an age old desire that we have for certainty, which is completely understandable. But for sure, that's a big motivation. And just kind of tying in a little bit of what you were just saying, I think one of the tragic aspects of this is that, and I've come across this to a great extent, connecting with and working with tons of people that have experienced some damaging effects from self-negating non-duality is that a significant portion of these people will divulge that they grew up with a narcissistic abuser, or they grew up, you know, not being able to trust themselves because of something like that. And so I think that I personally believe that a significant percentage of people that come to these teachings are actually suffering from the effects of that type of abuse, which is, feeling disappointments in maybe, allowing other people to make decisions for you, or feeling like, maybe you don't like all these parts of yourself that has been shamed. And so it makes it very attractive and almost sort of like familiar. And I remember that you wrote in your book, The Dark Night of the Soul, something like, you were hearing, this whole idea that you're the problem, and how it felt obvious to you, like, oh, of course I'm the problem, and because you had experienced some type of narcissistic dynamic. So I think you can probably relate to that as well.
Absolutely. I think, I was thinking about this after our last conversation, and I think obviously, as we say, we're drawn to the spiritual teachings or teachers that replicate or amplify what we're familiar with. And of course, that all happens unconsciously. We're not meaning to do that. So we're drawn to them based on our histories and the trauma of that kind of abuse. And just to say, this kind of abuse can be subtle. It can also be not seeing like abuse of, often can be not seeing. It is subtle, and it took me a very long time to realize that I'd been traumatized by it, to actually use that kind of language. And I think the other thing that happens is that we're also drawn to teachings that replicate our adaptations to the situations. So, for me, one of the ways that I adapted, if you like, was to withdraw, to retreat in various ways. Not necessarily obviously, because I would often be quite outspoken, so it wasn't necessarily going quiet, but there would be some level of removing myself and my own needs or desires or wants from a situation. And so when teachings say things like desires are wrong or imply that needs are selfish, again, there's a familiarity with those sorts of teachings. And I think together that makes a really toxic brew, doesn't it? I mean, you described last time, you described the teachings as nectar laced with poison. And I think that was such a great description. So it's a spiritualized version of the same messages
Exactly.
that we got as kids, right?
Yeah. And as you're saying, some of those things that you did as sort of coping mechanisms. I remember somebody had said, I think it was Michael Lydon, that we both know, the
Mm.
therapist, and he was saying that it really spiritualizes trauma responses. The withdrawing, or the self-blaming, or the having poor boundaries or no boundaries, and all of those things. And disembodiment, disassociation, all of that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. Absolutely. You mentioned not healing in isolation last time. And I think that's another really important part of what we're talking about, that what happens in the kind of abuse that we're discussing is often that we feel very alone, that we are very alone and often isolated in various ways by the abuser, split off from people in different ways. And so many of those spiritual messages are around the shaming of need, or
Yeah.
not needing anything, or you should be able to provide what you need from within yours. So everything you need is within you already,
Yeah.
and all of that. And just the other day, I saw a post where somebody was saying, "Oh, I know I have to love myself before anybody else will love me." And my heart hurt for them. I just think that's such a damaging message to put out there. When you connect with people now, do you find that's a recurring theme that people think they should be able to do it for themselves?
Very much so. And I think that one of the things with that notion, and of course, that's also a double edged sword because, it sounds amazing, oh, I can get everything I need within myself, but it's also kind of preventing you from seeking any type of, interdependency or reaching out for support from friends or communities or even, psychotherapists. And then it ends up oddly becoming this type of like isolated individualism, right? That like, you know, you should be able like radical self-reliance. And yeah, I think also a big thing is validation. And that's so shamed in self-negating non-duality that it's really like, the desire for validation is, the cause of suffering. Of course, it's unspiritual, but it's the selfish ego just wanting to prop itself up and, have other people any desire to be validated or to be seen for who you are, seen for your suffering is so shamed. Um, and so I think a big thing with people who are coming out of this is definitely like needing to or I don't know what you say, like deprogram that staunch internalized belief that where you kind of don't have permission to want a healthy sense of validation. And of course, a lot of people who suffer from narcissistic abuse have, that's kind of such a core of it is, invalidating you and, feeling like your needs and perspectives aren't seen or valued. And so, like you were saying with, the benefits of doing healing work in a relational setting with other people is being able to share that validation with one another. I see your suffering. Your suffering's real. Your suffering matters. Your suffering is important and deserves healing. And, let's help each other. Of course, nobody can heal you for you, but we can, certainly have that relationship where, it's strengthening our own healing to be doing it alongside other people who are doing the same thing.
I very much relate to all of that. I can remember leaving home late teens, early 20s. And one of the things that I would say is, yeah, it was a difficult childhood, but it made me independent. And there was a pride in what I would now call, that sort of unhealthy independence, unhealthy self-defense in that sense. And I totally understand that it was necessary. And I have huge love for that younger me in that position. But I could see how that was simply defending against my own vulnerability. And so this idea that not needing is good,
Right.
I think is so problematic. And yes, absolutely. I think it's not until we have that kind of sincere validation from someone who knows, who's able to give that validation, that seeing, that we can actually really start to touch into the realness of our pain. I can remember being with somebody some years ago and saying, "I want you to know how bad it was," as I was crying, and them just meeting that with, "Tell me how bad it was," but with absolute openness and receptivity. And I think that's fundamental to any sort of healing. I don't think it's possible to actually touch into our vulnerability on our own by definition. I mean,
Sure.
just don't think it's possible on that kind of level. Of course, once we've started to experience that, I think we can. But it's doing that with somebody else is such an integral part of that. I just wanted to sidestep for a moment into a little discussion about what we mean by ego, what our understanding of that was and what it is now, because it's a word that's bandied around
Yeah, it's
as
true.
if it is this thing that's we're supposed to get rid of.
Mhm.
What would you say about that now?
So I think that's a good point because it's so often that, like you said, it's being bandied about, but in so many cases, people are using this word, but they mean something different by it, or they don't even know what they mean by it because they've just heard it and they think it's bad. I think a big a big thing that happens is that egocentrism gets conflated with the ego. And I would say for me, I think a lot of people would say, oh, the ego is the part of you that, only cares about yourself and not other people and that sort of thing. Um, having a big ego, if you will. But I relate to the ego more so as sort of like the psyche, and that there is an unconscious or subconscious level of that psyche, and then there's a conscious level of the psyche. And of course, when people talk about the ego, it's a major part of our sense of individuality and personhood. And a healthy ego is so important and a beautiful thing. But these teachings believe there's no such thing as a healthy ego because ego is inherently unhealthy according to, this type of spirituality. So I think that's a really good point that you bring up.
Yeah, I mean, my sense over the years of what is often referred to as ego is that it's complex and multi-layered, right? That there is a part that we might call the adapted self or the survival self or the neurotic self, whatever, the part that had to twist and turn and contort itself into different shapes in order to survive the kind of circumstance that we've been talking about, the part of us that had to become in relation to narcissistic abuse and all the adaptations we had to make to that. I think there's another layer of what we might call ego. I don't know, something that feels more real to us. We were talking last time about all the qualities that you discovered that got repressed along with all of the pain. And I think for me in the former, in the survival self, there's there's a sense of pain and discomfort and contractedness and all of that. In the more, what we might call the more real self, there's much more aliveness and joy and a sense of ease about being this. I know I went through a phase a while back of really touching into what the word ego just naturally came up, which was a surprise because that had never really happened before. But I had a sense of maybe this younger part of myself that had just been struggling along
Yeah,
for a really long time. And there were waves of compassion and love really for this part. Just, that sense of the validation that we were talking about is now sufficiently internalized that it happens spontaneously quite often. But, just that sense that you will have with yourself or with somebody else where you just go, oh, no wonder you feel like you do. I mean, of
exactly.
course, which again is the absolute opposite to what was going on when you were involved in those teachings,
So much. Because think
right?
about the utter invalidation of hearing so many of the teachers that I followed say trauma is just a story. So almost like you're making it up. It's the epitome of invalidating one's experience, and it's repeated, by everyone from Rupert Spira to, you know, I mean, that's just one example for me because I heard that a lot from him, but it's so commonplace there that, and again, it's so attractive. Oh, it's just a story. So if I just see through it as just a story, then it doesn't exist. Not realizing that, trauma is held in our body. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Do you think things are changing, or from what you hear when you meet with people, is all of this still happening?
So, of course, and I don't know if I would say maybe in the last 10 years or so, it seems like there's been this big wave of like trauma awareness and trauma healing, almost sometimes like ad nauseum or too much of like everything is trauma, that's the lens for everything. But I have noticed that it seems like some of these non dual teachers are kind of trying to weave that in with what they're saying. I think some of them more so now maybe saying that, people with a lot of trauma may need to do some type of trauma healing work before they, get involved with these sorts of teachings. Um, and so I do think, but I still think that it's still not really compatible because so many of the rest of the messages are invalidating trauma, and they're kind of marketing to people who are suffering from things like trauma, that here's a way to, be invulnerable to it and see it as, not real.
I think what you just said is so important, that it's really the marketing of invulnerability, isn't it? Which is so disingenuous. I think the more we meet our vulnerability and all of the things that we couldn't feel for all sorts of reasons, not least the environment that we were in, the more we touch into a tender, exquisite kind of sense of our humanity. And for me, that far outweighs anything else I've experienced.
I would say, the shift from self-abandonment to self-compassion has been the most extraordinary, powerful shift. I mean, it really has been a game changer. And I can't say that I succeed in having self compassion all the time, but I know that when I am sort of practicing that, or, building and growing that inner voice of self compassion, that where I can sort of relate to these parts of myself, dialogue with them with, like you said, that tenderness and that kindness and that sort of like befriending, that really, brought me onto a new pathway that's felt so much better and more effective as well.
Completely. Yeah. I'd like to hear a bit more about your work with people, but just before we get into that, you I was been thinking recently a lot about the idea of presence and being present. Not least because the subtitle of my book about the Dark Night is The Journey from Absence to Presence. And for me now, my understanding of what it is to be present to ourselves is the meeting of everything that hasn't been met before, all the parts of ourselves, the feelings, everything that we've been talking about. And so we could say it's equally a journey um, from there to here,
Mm.
or from less mature to more mature, or less humane to more humane, from harsh to, we were talking about the inner critic, from harsh to kind.
Mhm.
And I've, experienced that in myself. I certainly experience it in people I work with. And yet this notion of being present is banded around as if somehow that's also a way of not being with yourself. And
Mhm.
I find that so problematic.
It's quite twisted in a way. What I find really interesting and great about how you said a journey from absence to presence, because so much of the self-negating non-dual, and a lot of this comes from some traditional Eastern paradigms, but it's more of saying going from the presence of a self to the absence of a self, which is kind of the exact opposite. But what you're saying is going from, the absence of self in the sense of repressing it or shunning it or not allowing it to be present, to allowing all of oneself to be present.
Completely. I mean, it's an ever increasing sort of circle of inclusion, if you want to put it like that, isn't it? That rather than a splitting off or separating out of things, it's a bringing them in. yes, I'd love to hear more now about the kinds of things that you're hearing from people, because I know you shared a bit with me before, and I was quite shocked actually by the extent of the damage that people report.
Yeah. It's very, very tragic, and it's so much more widespread than, than most people would realize. I know Tim Freak, and you know, he's somebody who really kind of deconstructs and critiques the philosophy about the nature of self and reality. But after, I've sort of shared with him the work that I do and how many people reach out to me just so damaged, that he said, I had no idea the extent to which people were actually being really psychologically damaged by this. And so I think many people are kind of shocked, and it can be almost, I think, difficult to really grasp the level of this. But, the stories are always, they're different and unique to each person, but the themes are always the same. It's, the disembodiment, the disassociation, the nihilism, the depression, the lack of motivation, the loss of agency. For a lot of people, they even, lose access to memories. And so much of it is that sense of, but this is what I've learned, the non-existence of self. This is the absolute truth, and I can't question it, because then I'm betraying the truth. So most people feel very trapped in that dynamic, where any time that they go to sort of challenge that, to embrace the self, what have you, it feels like um and it's immediately invalidated, because you're taught that this can't be questioned with the mind, and if you do that, you're proving your ignorance and all of that. So that's a major thing, is people, and that's where validation comes in too, where one of the best and most helpful things about connecting with other people who've been harmed by it, and I've organized some support meetups for this, is to be able to validate that it makes sense that you're experiencing all these things. You're not doing something wrong. And, sadly, a lot of it comes down to like giving ourselves and giving each other permission, to embrace yourself and to question these ideologies, and to have self-compassion and have agency again, and follow your desires. And, I've heard people say, even, when I want to go kayaking, this voice comes in and says, well, that's egoic. It's this egoic desire to do something, because it can be so extreme of, stop doing and just be, and stop seeking anything or wanting anything, that it so completely disrupts people's lives. And for many people, it gets to a point of actually impairing their functioning and their difficulty in relating to other people, and social um, relational impairments and things like that. So yeah, a lot of the work and the healing journey is so much about um being able to question, and also a lot of people will mention, that they just don't trust themselves anymore, which we talked about already. So much of what needs to happen is building up the ability to trust yourself, which is not easy. And if you've grown up with people that gaslight you and, you know, kind of groom you to not trust your perceptions, it's really, really difficult. Um, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking about how cultish all of this is. That I think cults are inherently narcissistic anyway,
Yes.
right? And that idea that you can't question, I think, is also very common in cults and high control groups, isn't it? The whole thing. But I think what's so insidious about the self-negating non-dual teachings is that they would claim to be the opposite, even though they're doing very similar things. They would say, this is I'm not here for my own self-aggrandizement. I'm simply here to share. This is whatever language they would use. There's just a movement here to share the truth, and yet the kinds of things that go on within those groups or within those teachings is very cultish. Now, I think particularly when you get this sort of this looping philosophy, where, as you were saying, well, if you question the truth of that, then it proves the assertion. That for me is a real indicator that there's something afoot.
A real trap there. And I'm glad that you brought up the cult element, because actually a good way of kind of giving a window into that kind of healing journey. Once I started learning, and I only a couple years ago even started kind of hearing about things like spiritual abuse, and that it happens in, not, of course, not just in non-duality, the Eastern things, but spiritual abuse in Christianity, that, Jesus is the only truth and way to salvation, or, different types of cults, even like the Jim Jones suicide cults and things like that. But so many of the characteristics of cults are present. And it's hard to grasp that, because it's not like, there's this one in-person commune where everyone's there. It's not necessarily a physical cult, but it's sort of this widespread, like, even an ideology can have cult like dynamics. And so one of the things that's also been really helpful is, and there's a lot of material out there in support for how do people who recognize that they've been in a cult, how do they extract themselves from it? How do they deprogram from those ideologies? And how do they move on? And how do they get back a sense of self that's been so destroyed? And, sadly, that's not an easy thing to do. And a lot of people say that it will take them years and years to do that. And, of course, so much of this involves, when you start out with self-negating non-duality, so much of the narrative and the instructions are, we're going to strip away everything that you think is true about yourself and about reality. But you often, don't recognize that after that, you're reprogrammed with this new ideology, that the self doesn't exist and salvation comes from negating the self. And that's, again, really can be a bit subtle and tricky. And then, one of the main things with cults too is that individuality is stripped away. And here, it's almost the epitome of that is complete self-erasure and annihilation, and the making it out so that it's sort of undermining the value and let's say the value of rationally criticize or critiquing, because it's beyond, this is an order of truth that's beyond, completely beyond the mind and questioning and all of that. So yeah, I would say that a lot of the work, I think even just if you read sort of guides on how to heal from cults, it could apply very well to this.
Yeah, yeah. I think that final part about that you just said about the undermining of the mind is so key in this, that painting of anything coming from the mind as a suspect, as you say, just to be replaced with a different kind of ideology, and an ideology that pretends it's not an ideology.
Yeah. And also, another element of cults that's so common is kind of the shaming and even bullying of anybody who wants to leave, so to speak. They're portrayed as ignorant or not getting it or as weak. And that's such a huge part of the rhetoric and this kind of non-duality, where it may not be as aggressive as it is where, people are shunned, because a lot of times these aren't physical places, but, anybody who goes on to kind of question it or re-embrace the self is, labeled as ignorant, literally as ignorant, and, ignorant and falling back into ignorance, or that sort of thing, which is again where you get the whole, difficulty in leaving that pathway. It's very tricky.
Yeah. There's a not so subtle superiority in all of that, isn't there? To be in the in group, as it were, one of the ones who's got it. And I think that again goes back to what we were saying about that kind of narcissism, one of the things that I studied a while back when I was doing a philosophy master's was the notion of collective narcissism. So the idea is that groups can behave narcissistically. It doesn't mean that everybody within the group is narcissistic, but that the group itself, yes, is sort of a narcissistic entity. And part of what that means is that there's an in-group and an out-group. The in-group often feels threatened or superior to the out-group. And of course, there are many examples of this in spirituality and politics in lots of places. But I think that came to mind when I was thinking about what you were just saying, that there's I think particularly for those of us who experience being on the wrong side of narcissistic abuse as children, there is a draw to being in the in-group because we experience being outcast or not seen, or the other things we were describing. And certainly I experienced that there was a draw to that because it seemed to offer what I hadn't had as a child, right? I mean, thankfully I got through the other side of that, but I think it's worth saying there's a reason why people do that, right? Because it feels better to be on the inside than it does to be on the outside of that kind of group, doesn't it?
Yeah. One of the knowers.
Exactly. One of the people who's got it, or whatever it is, whatever the terminology is in that particular group. Thank you so much, Jessica. Is there anything else that you think it would be good to throw into the mix with all of this?
I guess I just wonder if maybe there's any sort of calls to action that could be suggested. And I think, certainly one of them I would say is, if somebody recognizes that they've experienced this, that it can be really helpful to learn about cult dynamics, to also learn about, because one of the things that I eventually did, and also a lot of people that I work with, is start to learn about narcissistic abuse and the effects of it. And then what, research is showing are the healthiest and most effective ways to kind of overcome that, which is strengthening your boundaries, having a healthy sense of self, exploring your personal authenticity, getting to kind of choose the type of person that you want to be without the constraints from other people telling you how you should be. And of course, the befriending and the self-compassion. Um, yeah, I guess maybe that's a little bit of something to leave people with.
Yes, I'd say along with that, if you're feeling like you're not getting it, if you're involved in some sort of spirituality or spiritual teaching and you feel like you're not getting it, or that you're somehow wrong or feeling shamed, if it doesn't feel good in your body, for sure, I think that's an indication that something is probably amiss. And I'd say to look out for people who seem to have absolute certainty. One of my bugbears, in those sorts of books, is the number of random capitals that he used. That often words like truth or presence or awareness or all of those words will have capitals at the start. And I always think that's a real sign of something. It hints at something dogmatic, right? Something.
Absolutely.
Whereas I think anybody anybody making very binary either or statements, like there is no self or get rid of the ego, I think it's fair to say that the world is much more complex, multi-layered, interconnected, interrelational. And yeah, if that's what you're seeing, then I think what you just said is a great suggestion. And certainly for me, reading up about narcissistic dynamics and cult dynamics were really, really helpful. Also, in recognizing what was going on within myself, as
Yeah.
well as seeing what was going on externally. And you also have your collective soul revival group.
Yes.
I just love the name of that. I think that's so perfect.
Sure, if maybe it was like too, I don't know, grandiose or like spiritual sounding, but I think it tends to work.
I think that's exactly it. I think so much of what we're talking about is getting those pieces of ourselves back, isn't it? It is a revival,
Yeah.
literally reviving
Yes.
the self, and to do that collectively, as we were saying, is so important. So I'll put all of the details of that and how to contact
Great.
you in the show notes.
Mm,
And yeah, an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
yes. Much appreciated, Fiona.